You're flying blind on a rocket cycle? Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be reviewing Adventures on Dungeon Planet by Johnston Metzger. This is available in PDF and print on demand on Drive-Thru RPG. I'll put a link to that down below, and it's a science fantasy supplement for Dungeon World. It costs $7 for the PDF and $15 for the softcover colour version, which is what I've got here, but you also get a copy of the PDF thrown in with that. This is a supplement for the Dungeon World game by Sage Kobold, which I'm running 2 games of at the moment, and I'm a huge fan of it, taking as it does the feel of old school D&D, but with a streamlined and more simple rule set focused on game fiction and narrative. For a more detailed breakdown, let's see my review of Dungeon World, which is just there. Now, I'm a massive fan of space opera, especially the cheesy old school science fantasy, as you'll have probably guessed from my Zoltan from Flash Gordon, played in the film by Brian Blessed, quote at the start of this video. And I was very pleased to come across this supplement on Drive-Thru RPG, and at a mere $15 US, which is about £9.33 in British pounds, for this softcover printed version with the PDF thrown in, I decided to grab myself a copy. So, what does the book actually contain? Well, it starts off with the introduction, which lays out the aim of the book in a no-frills style, with no unnecessary padding. You do need a copy of Dungeon World to make use of the contents of this book, and the book's going to provide some extra playbooks or classes for characters, and some additional options for those found in the Dungeon World rulebook. It also contains some additional tools for GMs to take their Dungeon World games into the realm of science fantasy. The first section is titled Character Classes, and it discusses the new playbooks available. These are the Earthling, an adventurer thrown out of time and space into unfamiliar environments; the Engine of Destruction, a robot or artificial being of destructive power; the Mutant, a physically unstable deviation from societal norms; and the Technician, who controls their environment through the power of science. And these 4 classes or playbooks replace the Paladin, Fighter, Druid and Cleric, respectively, from the Dungeon World book, fulfilling much the same roles as each of those classes, but putting a sci-fi futuristic spin on the familiar Dungeon World and D&D tropes used in a more traditional fantasy game. The moves and abilities available to these classes are all very interesting and have a very futuristic feel, but it's an old-fashioned version of the future. It's more Dan Dare or Flash Gordon than more modern iterations of science fiction, with powers running the gamut from psychic eyes, which is forcing people to answer questions truthfully, to the various automated systems built into the Engine of Destruction. I very much enjoyed reading these classes, and they brought back a very nostalgic feeling in me, which may sound odd given that they depict futuristic beings, but they very much reminded me of those classic adventure comics way back before they became reclassified as graphic novels, and books that I used to read in my youth. We move on to a section titled Robots and Aliens, and after all, what's science fiction without some kind of artificial life forms and aliens? The chapter provides the additional races of androids, white apes and aliens, along with some examples of how they can be used with existing Dungeon World classes and with the various new classes. There are also some monster stats included for GMs who wish to throw androids and aliens against their players. We move on to a chapter titled Spaceships and Ray Guns, and it offers additional hirelings and equipment for science fantasy games, keeping coins as a generic currency for ease of compatibility with Dungeon World. Although, in a little sideline that I quite like, the game does encourage you to use different terms such as credits or whatever in your games if you wish. These are all very well written and functional. However, The main interesting part to me was the rules for spaceships, since vehicles were not something extensively covered in the more fantasy-based Dungeon World. Essentially, spaceships are like monsters, with their own hit points, tags, descriptions, etc., save that PCs pilot them. You buy a ship-like equipment and you upgrade it to have additional options by buying various bolt-ons to the basic model of the ship. When you pilot a ship, player characters use the ship's hit points, armour, etc., but they use their own moves / abilities and scores to make rolls. I very much like this system. It adds a tiny little bit more complexity, although not really very much, to the system. It's one of the most functional and simple ship-based systems that I've seen in a role-playing game. The next section is titled the Dungeon Planet GM, and it offers some advice to the Games Master, essentially building on the advice offered in Dungeon World and adding in some additional science fantasy concepts. For instance, fronts and dangers, where a couple of new dangers, alien threats and science run amok, are added to the GM's repertoire, along with some sample fronts showing an aspiring Dungeon Planet GM how they could be used. This is very useful because it shows you what the writer had in mind and what they were envisioning when they came up with those two dangers. The next segment is called Planetology, and it's another very interesting section. It discusses how to build planets for your science fantasy game, the backdrops for your sessions, and how to keep them interesting. Essentially, a planet is defined by its appearance, behaviour and planetary culture, with various examples being offered, rather like how steadings or settlements are built in Dungeon World. Various narrative tags are then assigned to the planet to fill in some extra detail and flavour, and this is a great workable system that uses the main strength of the Dungeon World game. It focuses on the game narrative, using rules to support that rather than having them get in the way. We then continue on to science fantasy monsters, and this offers a veritable smorgasbord of science fantasy creatures for your player characters to battle, parley with and overcome. I was glad to see that this mini bestiary didn't feature the usual monsters you'd expect, although the stars had obviously aligned, and as with most bestiaries nowadays, a few mythos creatures had snuck in. But mostly the monsters were a range of more inventive and interesting creatures, including such horrors as the Cloud of String, also known as the Terror from Planet X, and the Maggot Wolf. The book then rounds off with a list of influences. So to conclude, I was very happy with Adventures on Dungeon Planet. Whilst it isn't the prettiest book I own, most of the interior being black and white, although I do really love this picture on the front by Howard V. Brown. It really captures the mood of vintage space adventure for me. The book does stand up very well against the main Dungeon World book, adding in a lot of options to take your game into interesting new realms at a more than reasonable price. If you have an affection for space opera or science fantasy and you want a cheap and cheerful system for running adventures in that setting, or perhaps you just want to do something a little bit different with your Dungeon World game, you cannot really go far wrong with Adventures on Dungeon Planet. Although, to remind you, you do need the Dungeon World core book to use the contents of this book. And with the PDF only costing a few dollars on its own, this book is an absolute bargain. I highly recommend it. So I hope if you've enjoyed this video, you'll consider clicking on like to it. You can subscribe to the channel by clicking on the red dice up there. If you have any comments on Adventures on Dungeon Planet or this video, please, as always, put them in the comments box below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. Thank you very much for watching and for listening. Until I see you next time, I look forward to reading what you write. Take care, and again, thanks very much for listening.